I feel like being a lawyer and also being like a psychonaut feel like such disparate sort of hobbies. But I love that you've just also found a way to like turn it into one thing of like, okay, cool, let me figure out how I can do the intellectual property of psychedelics, which I think is great fun.
I saw there was a interest in bringing novel psychedelic compounds through FDA. Actually, psychedelics have been the area that I was most interested in. I studied science as an undergrad after my first psychedelic experiences and was just following the science, really interested in it, and saw this was another area.
I think our first podcast was one where Rick Doblin was on as well, and we were talking about IP ethics.
Chris was saying that some people argue that actually the first use of intellectual property and like protecting your information was with indigenous communities and their spiritual practices, which were often quite revered, and they were protected by those communities and held within those communities, which I thought was very interesting. I'd never thought of intellectual property in that way.
Yes, and I do think this is a really good place to get oriented, because often when we think about patents today, we think about exactly what they are today. It's this 20-year period of exclusivity, and these are the rules that you need to pass to be able to get it, and here's what it covers.
Hello and welcome back to the DeSci podcast. Today we are kicking off our series on intellectual property. I'm joined by Chris and Graham. Chris is our in-house IP lawyer at Molecule, and Graham is the founder of Calyx Law. And Graham, I'd love if you could introduce yourself.
Sure. Well, first, it's really great to be here. I'm really glad to be with you too, Chris. I think the first time we spent more than an hour together was actually sharing a podcast ourselves, so it's good to somehow circle back and do another one. So I'm the founder of Calyx Law, which is a primarily now IP law firm. I started it in 2016 to work with cannabis companies, actually. So I was trying to think of a way to use my expertise in patents in a market where there were particular challenges that I felt were useful for my background. And I had worked for about a decade with mostly branded pharma, but also tech. The sort of end of my large law firm career before I started my firm was primarily working with Google and on a number of Android and smartphone patent litigations during the smartphone wars that maybe we'll talk about later. Just coincidentally in 2016, it happened to be the year that cannabis became legal in California for adult use, and there was a lot of activity and a lot of innovation that was really interesting for a patent lawyer, but it was still a time when large law firms were not that interested in pursuing the cannabis market because of the fact that even still today, there really isn't banking in cannabis. It's very difficult as a law firm to sort of manage their risks working with cannabis companies. So I saw it as an interesting area, and also I was, to some degree, had been a kind of stoner since high school. So I was very, very personally interested in the kind of cannabis community and was aware of it, and felt that I could, communicate well with people in that space. From 2016 to about 2019, I did primarily work with cannabis companies, especially a lot that were bringing, or at that time, getting investment to bring cannabinoid-based compounds through FDA. So sort of using my background, doing patent work for pharma. And then in 2019, I saw there was a interest in bringing novel psychedelic compounds through FDA. Actually, psychedelics have been the area that I was most interested in. I studied science as an undergrad after my first psychedelic experiences and was just following the science, really interested in it, and saw this was another area that I could use what I thought was my expertise in something that crossed really well over into my kind of personal interests too. And so I suppose from sort of 2019 until today, most of my work has been in kind of novel psychedelic chemistry, doing IP work. So it's sort of a mix of filing and prosecuting patent applications on behalf of companies, and also doing due diligence on behalf of investors, looking at companies and looking at the IP portfolios of companies to see if they're valuable to invest in, I suppose. And so maybe I'll stop there. Probably more than enough background. I think there's a lot of like interesting controversies in particular, and there's a lot of tension that really also draws me to that space, and was also some of the reason I was actually on that first podcast with Chris, because I think Chris is one of the most creative people I met thinking about IP and the controversies in IP and sort of how to untangle them. So I'm looking forward to hopefully chatting about some of that today.
Oh no,
That's
well,
crazy.
yeah. Oh, please go ahead, Ella.
I was going to say the one thing that did immediately come into my mind is I feel like being a lawyer and also being like a psychonaut feel like such disparate sort of hobbies. But I love that you've just also found a way to like turn it into one thing of like, okay, cool, let me figure out how I can do the intellectual property of psychedelics, which I think is great fun. And it's also, I think, how you sort of have gotten to know Chris with your work through SciDAO as well.
Yeah, and actually, I think our first podcast was a microbuzz or microdose. Where
Microdose.
Rick Doblin
with Rick Doblin.
was on as well, and we were talking about IP ethics, and I want to mention, I guess I think it's worth everyone kind of understanding, Graham, how you and I are connected in this space, because we cross over, of course, between our work in the psychedelic space and in the DeSci space, increasingly so. And one thing that was really cool about as Graham and I had just been doing kind of the back-breaking, but more or less sort of cutting edge, big law, just that type of litigation for a while. And when people can back off of that, there's a lot of cool things. There's a lot of weird things that happen in the IP market. And when people back off of it and get to be creative and work in these, what in many ways are also a type of movement lawyering, like working in the psychedelic space, working with plant medicine, things like this. It's there's a whole culture around it that also lawyering is there to sort of engage. It has to engage with, and so how it engages with culture in this space is that ends up being really important, and that's why we talk about IP ethics. And so I started doing some work with Graham at his firm at Calyx. And then as we were working on different things, I remember telling him, just as I started getting into the work with VitaDAO that ultimately led to the molecule protocol and everything that I worked on with Jesse and everything. But Graham and I were chatting, and I'm like, there's something about this tokenized IP. I'm going to go for that. And he's like, yeah. Like, Calyx, like, we want to do that, and he's going to keep doing the psychedelic stuff. And then we really got to, merge these, I think, in a really cool way inside SciDAO. And there's other people in this group that are really a circle Graham has built across this space that I've been fortunate to connect into, that are also merging into what decentralized science is. So it's really cool, and for these reasons too, I just couldn't think of a better person. Graham and I have had a chance to teach together with the Chacruna Institute in different classes on plant medicine and intellectual property in that space, and it always requires us to talk about IP, international trade, and economics, because that's what's impacting humans, more than subject matter eligibility for a patent and things like this that are otherwise the technical stuff. And so as we want to talk about that today, which I just think it's such a difficult perspective for one to gain and understanding in this market without just experiencing and spending a lot of time in it, especially in the past decade, because this market has evolved. But it's so necessary, I think, for us to understand DeSci well and what the potential is for DeSci. So I'm just thrilled to have Graham as someone who we can pick his brain and kind of talk about all of that, because I think we'll really be able to paint, hopefully, a picture that makes this both exciting and understandable in what is otherwise, I think, for most people, a very opaque space. So yeah, thanks, and really excited to be here as well.
Yeah, and thanks. And I was remiss not to mention that Calyx Law is certainly not just myself, but I'm very fortunate to have a lot of people who, partly by nature of the fact that working in psychedelics is very interesting, and partly by nature that being able to work in a small firm can have some advantages. I really like to be able to work with a lot of great other people too. And yeah, I think, Chris, you put your finger on a lot of things that did resonate with me about why I so appreciated. I think the last thing you mentioned too, just about how patents are complicated, I think both sort of from a legal perspective and a technical perspective, and because people spend so much time thinking about both the legal and technical sides of what a patent is, they think little about the ethical sides. I think I may have been fortunate to even realize that there was this ethical side to it, because when I first started going to cannabis conferences and telling people I was a patent lawyer, I really met almost two completely polarized types of people. I met some people who said, "Oh, I've been trying really hard to find somebody who will work with a cannabis company. I'm really excited. Here's like my invention and tell me all about it." And I meet this other type of person who was like, "Why are you at this conference? Get out of this conference. Like, I hope nobody ever patents anything in cannabis. It's the only people that are going to come and patent things in cannabis are going to be Philip Morris and Monsanto, and they're going to take over the whole industry. They're going to push everybody out. Like, this is for the people who have been in it, since the legacy markets and all the sort of newcomers who were coming and trying to obtain monopolies on genetics and other things were taking advantage and shouldn't even be there. And there were similar issues in the psychedelic space too, about the fact that many of these psychedelic compounds, if not most, really have long histories of not just community use but traditional use and indigenous use. And if people are filing patents, is the reward of a patent really even appropriate, and are patents even the right instrument to use? And so, Chris had been thinking about many of those things even before. I think it dawned on you the way it did for me with psychedelics and cannabis. I was, excited to be able to, pick Chris's brain in the beginning. So it seems odd to be coming here now to share some of the things that many of them I probably have learned from Chris, or at least learned by being inspired by many of the things Chris has been involved in.
I think that...
Well, our Love Fest also, I'll just add too, how lucky we are to have Ella, because...
I was like, there's quite a bromance going on.
Yeah.
You can ask us questions about patents.
But it's true, but it is true. I think we've just been looking forward to this because Ella, as well as, Graham and I get into the patent weeds too much. Ella's just one of the best people I've worked with over the past year in science communication and being able to translate, what is complex stuff into everyday language. And it ranges everything from science like bioscience to also just technical information, which is what we're having to deal with. And so thank you, Ella, for also, being willing to join our bromance and have a conversation with us, so that we can hopefully, say something useful.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
Reserve my compliments till the end to see how tough you are on the question.
Yeah, I was going to say, let's just test that first to see if I deserve the compliments. But I think actually the discussion that you guys were having about cannabis and about psychedelic medicines takes us really nicely into our first topic, which is like sort of the history of intellectual property. Because as you were saying, it's not just patents and trademarks. It's a sort of a deep sort of can of worms once you really start opening it. And in a conversation that Chris and Graham and I were having a couple of days ago, Chris was saying that some people argue that actually the first use of intellectual property and like protecting your information was with indigenous communities and their spiritual practices, which were often sort of quite revered, and they were protected by those communities and held within those communities, which I thought was very interesting. I'd never thought of intellectual property in that way. But Graham knows a lot about how intellectual property came to be, and I think it's important to sort of track that journey to understand where intellectual property is today and also where it might go. So Graham, I'd love if you could walk us through the history of intellectual property as a concept.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'll do my best, and I do think this is a really good place to get oriented, because often when we think about patents today, we think about exactly what they are today. It's this 20-year period of exclusivity, and these are the rules that you need to pass to be able to get it, and here's what it covers. But seeing the way that they've evolved and seeing how it's been used in different societies at different times gives us some realization that the sort of levers we can use to create the incentive that a patent provides are maybe more numerous than we think, and maybe there's more flexibility, and especially going forward, there may be lots of opportunities to really shape what we call a patent is and what it does. So I guess starting kind of at the beginning, and that was the first time I had learned about that too, with shamanistic practices and indigenous practices, Chris. So I'll start with what I understand the beginning to be, which is in ancient Greece. So there was a city-state called Sybaris, which actually, I don't know that the word is used all that much now, but like Sybarite or Sybaritic actually refers back to this city-state. So it means something that is very opulently luxurious. And actually, this city-state became very well known at the time because it was a place of incredible wealth and luxury, and it attracted many people there to participate in this society where people were constantly feasting and dressing themselves up as most ornamented as possible. And part of the reason historians think that that city-state was like that was because they actually had this system, which people think is sort of the first instrument like a patent, where anybody who came up with a new luxury or some new refinement in luxury, or what they called any peculiar and excellent dish, because they had these feasts and people would bring all these different types of particularly seafood dishes. They gave them 1 year for all the profits for anybody who sold those. And so it was an encouragement for people to come, or for people who were there to come up with these more and more fancy, more and more luxurious items, either to eat or to wear. And actually, it became, for these feasts that they had, so notorious that they actually passed a law that you had to give invites more than a year in advance, so people would have sufficient time to dress themselves and figure out how they wanted to ornament themselves with different things, because they're all trying to outdo each other. And so this is thought of as the first sort of instrument like a patent, because it was something that gave incentive for people to come up with something new and to contribute with that something was new to this society and to these people. And it was the first time that people, even though we don't, I think, know what standards they used to determine if something was inventive in the sense of they gave this, the creator of this, the year of all the profits. We know that that was the concept behind it. It was coming up with something that people hadn't seen before, and trying to outdo each other in something that was particularly new. So when we think about just patents as a concept, this is sort of maybe the most basic way of thinking about it. It's a period of exclusivity given to generally an individual, the inventor, for some creation of something that generally has to be new. It's new and inventive. And we see it as providing this incentive or this reward for coming up with and contributing that invention to the society. The first codified patent statute, the first thing that sort of resembles what we think of as patents today, comes from Venice. So in 1474, Venice set up a whole patent system. So it's also not just the first patent statute, but it was the first administrative body too that that created a system for examining what the invention was. So if somebody applied for a patent, they would actually examine what the application was to see if it was something inventive. They actually would go to where the inventor was to look at the invention itself. So many of these inventions were like a mechanical device or a new process. For many of them are for blowing glass, for instance. So they would go to the glass blower and look at how the invention was and see if when they applied for the patent, they had disclosed all the information that actually described what their invention was. And then if it was something that was inventive, they gave them 10 years of exclusivity for it. I think we also see this as the start of the use of the term patent, which I think is helpful to understand too. So letters patent just means like an open letter. So it was considered sort of the converse of a letter close, which was like a closed letter. So if you wrote a letter to your friend or your colleague, you usually write a letter and you put a seal on it so it was closed, and you'd send it to whoever the recipient was. But for a letters patent, it was like an open proclamation, and rather than having a seal on it that closes it, it had like a little ribbon with a seal hanging from it to show there was like an open proclamation. And there would be a proclamation that would be hung somewhere where everybody could see it, that this particular individual, whoever was identified in this patent, had whatever it was that the patent was. So it was just like a royal decree. It didn't have to necessarily be for giving somebody exclusive rights in a patent. It could be for other things too, but this was sort of the background of what the patent was. And so in this first patent statute in Venice, we see it as being similar to in Sybaris, creating this incentive to come up with a new invention. But we also see the broader policy behind it too in Venice. So in Venice at the time, one of the goals was to attract merchants and artisans from other areas into Venice to try to make Venice a hub of activity and economic prosperity. And so the patents were not only granted for just new inventions in general, but it was just something that hadn't been in Venice before. So somebody could be using it in Florence or could be using it in France and coming from there, but it was for a reward for just bringing it to Venice. So it was like bringing it to Venice and telling people in Venice how to do it. We also see this sort of other aspect of why patents are important, besides just this incentive, which is the public disclosure. So the fact that somebody would bring it to Venice and disclose it, then the people in Venice would be able to do it. It was also used as a tool to sort of break these guilds. So there were guilds of people who were artisans, and the only way the kind of like the information about what they were doing could be acquired was by becoming an apprentice and learning to do it yourself. And they were very secretive about what they were doing. And the part of the policy was to, by encouraging people to tell the whole public what they were doing, that information would no longer reside within the guild, and the guild would no longer be able to control who had access to that. So it was sort of like another economic policy behind this type of patent. That sort of patent system diffused out from Venice into a lot of other parts of Europe. And then one of the next sort of stages a lot of people think about it for patents is actually the royal system in England, where the patent system, rather than just being a means of incentivizing new invention, became a means of patronage, really. So people just applied to the king, or I think it was maybe Queen Elizabeth at the time, when it was most notorious. And sometimes they would pay like 10, 12, 20 times what the per capita income was. Enormous amounts. I mean, only the very richest people could do it. And then they would get a monopoly, and they could get a monopoly on anything. It was actually became very notorious that a monopoly was given on salt. Salt obviously is not an invention, but somebody paid some enormous sum and became the person who had a letter of patent on salt. So, royal decree, this person paid however many, I don't know what people transacted with at the time, many pounds, and, had this monopoly on salt. And that actually led to sort of an uprising where there then became this statute of monopolies that sort of broke this system and said, no, we can only give patents out for things that are really inventions. And so I'll maybe fast forward a little bit to the current patent system, which is the one that I probably know most about and the one that has kind of now diffused to most other places, which is the U.S. patent system. And so the U.S. patent system is based on the U.S. Constitution grants the right. It's one of the kind of earliest clauses in the Constitution in Article 1. It's actually the only time in the U.S. Constitution, other than the Bill of Rights, where the word right is discussed, which many people bring up. It's something that was really an important part of the sort of consciousness in the United States. Like George Washington talked about patents in his first State of the Union address. Thomas Jefferson was the first patent examiner. I think even Abraham Lincoln had a patent. And in the U.S. system, the Constitution that provides for the patent, it's called the Progress Clause. So it is for purposes of, I should have the direct language in front of me, but the Progress Clause is for the progress of the useful arts and what is the Progress Clause? Chris, you probably know.
To promote the progress of science and useful arts.
By securing to inventors and authors for a limited time, the exclusive rights to their inventions and work, something like that. And so it really captures, even though I couldn't remember, it really captures like all aspects now of what the policy is. So it's for inventors and also authors, so it also covers copyrights, at least in the Progress Clause, but securing for inventors the exclusive right to their invention for a limited time. And in the conception in the U.S. system, it was seen sort of in distinction from the monopoly system of the kind of royalty in the Queen Elizabeth era as being something that was a specific creation for incentivizing innovation. One of the kind of quotes I like to always come back to is in a Supreme Court case describing the patent system that talks about the patent system as being the creation of society, and it was something that was designed for purposes really of public policy. And actually, Thomas Jefferson wrote a lot about this, how it wasn't something that's a natural right, which sometimes Chris knows more than me about some of this with like copyright. We think of like a moral right to our works. With a patent, it's seen less so as like a natural right or a moral right, but something that the government or the state provides for certain specific purposes, like in Venice for disclosing things so people would have greater access to it, or like in Sybaris for incentivizing people to come up with new things that they may not come up with otherwise. And so that's probably, at least it gets us to 1790 or 17 or thereabouts. And obviously there's many things after that we can talk about too, but I've probably rambled on too long, so I'll stop there.
Well, thanks. I always love hearing you tell histories on this, and there's a lot of different ways into the IP system, and one kind of meta arc that maybe I want to just highlight quickly that connects, Ella, what you were sharing and what we were chatting about the other day, and that's, when we look, David Graeber's last book, which he wrote with an archaeologist, David Graeber, the anthropologist, and they were, doing this broad survey of history, but most things that David Graeber writes I find incredibly intelligent and insightful, and he was really digging into some old history and kind of asking the question of when did us as a species really begin to contemplate a notion of property or sort of exclusivity around non-rival goods, around like ideas. It is a moment of abstraction that, well, at least evidently, as we can look in like the global economy, was a hugely important one, as IP in the global economy now is worth, over 70 trillion, according to the World Intellectual Property Organization. But when you look at, the where it first arises is this thought of, well, actually, we've always seen sacred knowledge and practices that communities organize around, oftentimes to cultivate and maintain wisdom, but that also, to this date, still also requires, I think, or leads one towards this guild tendency where you maintain trade secrets. When you were making your own weapons, things like this, it's very important. Any additional piece of secret knowledge you might have might be the comparative advantage you need. But this idea, again, to highlight, though, okay, we go through rites of passage, we think about what it means to come of age to access exclusive knowledge, comes here, and then we see this progress, and it progresses along interesting lines that track the economic history of Europe. Well, as we move through the Enlightenment, we really see this shift from where, like we were mentioning in England, the patent system there it had no connection to the inventor. It wasn't that because you invented the idea, and salt, of course, wasn't an invention, but in other instances, these would be for inventions. But in some ways, the economic logic early would be, well, we also perhaps, if this is for the best of the public good, we want to just give the patent to the entity that can manufacture most efficiently. So, well, maybe that's that. I don't think that was really articulated as such. Of course, I think it was much more of a patronage system. But we see the system shift. And as we mentioned, as we get into copyright, and as we move further into really the 18th and 19th century, the liberalism that emerged through the Enlightenment traditions in Europe led us to really connect with individual creation and individual property, and these Lockean notions of property really come up around work and everything like this. I mention this because it gets really important when this system from Europe spreads and then kind of it forces itself really through imperial trade agreements onto the rest of the world and onto cultures that don't necessarily view knowledge production and their epistemologies or cosmologies in the same way at all. And that is a huge problem in the global IP system. I mean, it's a huge problem to the detriment of all of us right now, because it's leading us to cultural side. We're just losing languages. We're losing whole systems of knowledge annually, just like we're losing other biodiversity, ecodiversity in all of these ways. And the IP system actually plays a role in this in these ethical ways. And I kind of also want to highlight, as Graham and I talk, you maybe even notice we're thinking about the Progress Clause. We recited it. it can sound like a prayer. I mean, for everyone's quick background, I also have a master's of theology and spent a long time studying religion, ethics, and politics. So I'm oftentimes interested in this nature of IP as well. But it almost sounds like a prayer. To promote the progress of science and useful arts. And law kind of is this way around IP. But what happens is we've given up our agency in our ability to express our own ethics. And that's what I think we'll also get into with DeSci, because DeSci is this space where we can go capture this essence, this origin of what we've always had, which is some also connection to the sacred, into IP. And actually now with tokenization and with these other means of organizing community, we can actually start to engage with this whole new world of reestablishing, breathing the sacred back into our creativity through the engagement of IP ethics. So anyways, just wanted to kind of share that arc.
Yeah. And you said something that I probably should have drawn out more. So maybe I'll draw it out from what you said, even though you suggested it well, which is how the IP system and patents in particular are so based on the kind of Enlightenment ethics and the European ethics, and how they do clash with the even just idea of knowledge creation in other cultures. The idea of a patent is really based in the way it rewards an inventor on the concept of the sort of sole inventor, the kind of gentleman inventor, working in his, at his workbench, the kind of, Enlightenment ideal of someone who can come up with a creation. But it doesn't even have a consideration for knowledge that arises as part of a community, or knowledge that's, passed down, or knowledge that maybe even comes from, from a higher power that's, handed down. Like it really has this very singular kind of nature of understanding of like what it is to produce something new, that it is kind of the stroke of genius, the like eureka moment that like this, gentleman has, and then, writes down and gets the reward from it. But that's, very, very different than how, other cultures might think about, knowledge and progress too, for that matter.
You guys have spoken about is like this sort of interplay between intellectual property being used as a tool for like controlling access to information and who gets to use it, but they've also been used, like intellectual property also gets used as this powerful tool for collaboration, of like means that people have to publicize what they've worked on, found, discovered, and it allows people to sort of build on that previous knowledge. And I think if you were to speak to the average person, they probably have a somewhat negative sentiment of this idea of patenting, of that it's just big companies, patenting inventions and stopping like sort of maybe small businesses or whatever from being able to create on that. And then there's all of these sort of runarounds that they do about patent extensions and that sort of thing. But I think it would be really lovely to hear from both of you as people who have, dedicated your lives to intellectual property, what your viewpoint on that topic is.
Yeah, I don't know how much of a non sequitur this is, but I thought it was really funny in reading it actually just a couple of days ago. I think of it because of how you mentioned patents can really just benefit big business. I might have otherwise said, had I not read this, that there is like a whole class of people who do sort of see themselves as like the gentleman inventor, people who think that they've come up with something and they're going to strike it rich based on some new idea they've had in their garage. The thing that I read a couple of days ago was on a website actually for one of the biggest companies that provides sort of advice to solo inventors who may not know a patent lawyer, don't work at a big company. And there's a disclaimer at the bottom of the website they were forced to put there by a court order that says that I think 500 and something thousand people have hired this company to help them with like their invention disclosure, filing a patent, licensing to companies. It's sort of the person who might think that they're going to make this like as seen on TV product to sell in stores. 9 people actually received licenses from companies. So there's like this disclaimer. So there's a lot of people who probably think they can be the solo inventor to strike it rich, but I think that's probably, even if it's in the imagination of many people, not something that's very likely for people to happen. So sort of knowing that and knowing at least because of my own work is generally with large companies, it really is the bigger companies that benefit from this. And the patent system itself, because it's designed based on the lobbying and the lawmaking that's caused by the lobbying from bigger companies, really reflects the interests of big companies. The patent system, as like the U.S. patent system, it has the same sort of stakeholders in a sense as much of the other like laws of the U.S. that we might take issue with. The pharmaceutical industry and the tech industry really are the ones that put all the money into trying to decide what patent laws should look like, even though often those two big lobbying groups are at odds with each other in terms of patent policy, but they generally are the ones that largely lead the type of just even discussions that go into the changes in patent law.
What I would would have prioritized what you just shared before what I'm about to share. So I'm going to talk a little bit about IP ethics, I think, and how it's connected to this, because Graham nailed this experience that I have, and I think, as Graham had mentioned as well, and Ellis, IP, just generally speaking, I mean, for better or worse, I can guarantee to everyone, and no one should feel bad, that nobody understands it that well as a system other than the people who are like really, really in it. And that's okay. And that's just how it has been. But I think as we move into DeSci and to tokenized IP, all of that is going to change. And as we continue to discuss, I think it'll become clear why. But we have these polarized responses. Graham at the cannabis conference saying, thank goodness I've been needing this person to protect me because I have a new strain and Monsanto's going to come and I need to protect it with a patent, blah, blah, blah. How do I do this? And then they're like, yeah, I have a couple $100. And you're like, all right, well, it'll be 10 grand to start to try and get the patent. And then if you ever want to enforce, at least 100 grand, and we can get more into these economics in detail, but they are the IP market. They are the patent licensing market right now. It's patent troll economics. 88% of every patent lawsuit in the United States in 2022 filed in the high-tech space was filed by patent trolls. 88%. That's 12%.
I was going to say, could you just explain what a patent troll is?
Thank you. Yeah. Patent troll is a group of guys like Graham and I who used to be patent litigators. Just meaning that.
I've defended against a lot of patent troll
cut their
cases.
teeth hard enough in patent litigation that you realize how to do it. And you go to bankruptcy proceedings for companies that go under, maybe around Silicon Valley, this happens all the time. And you just buy up patents on these fire sales off the open market. For investors, they're just trying to exit with something when a company's going under. And so how do you monetize it at all? Well, it's not enforcing it yourself. As everyone who tries comes to learn, it's letting someone else enforce for you who's an expert at it. And what these guys is they're expert enforcers. And that's good. That's okay. That is actually necessary. But what happens is just the way the patent system works is you can buy up really poor quality patents for a other host of reasons. Patent quality, what comes out of the patent office, whether it actually is valid or not, is everyone, I think, agrees there needs to be a lot of improvement. When litigated through to the merits, it's a coin toss. Last time, all types of selection bias in the data that emerges when you can study this stuff. So it's difficult to be as clear as the data might suggest, but the data shows a 50-50 chance of your patent being invalidated if you actually assert it through on the merits and run it all the way out. 95% of patent cases settle, so we also never see these things come out on the merits. And if they come out, again, it's for probably other reasons, but there's a problem. And so what happens is if you have a bad patent, but it has a really broad claim, you can assert that against 100 companies. Everyone who has a Wi-Fi router. And the way patent law works is it's strict liability enforcement. So I can sue the mom pa coffee shop who has the wireless router for their customers, has no idea. They just make coffee. And then I can sue the truck company. I can sue everyone on up to, Qualcomm or whoever's put in the chips in or Nokia, but that whole line, Best Buy, and you sue a whole supply chain, and all these people are saying, "Wow, I'm on the hook for a patent case, and what are damages?" And you look them up, it's millions. Wait, but this patent's nonsense. I don't know anything about it. Well, if you want to try to invalidate it, you're going to have to you're going to drop over 100 grand because you're going to litigate it in a certain way. And on the other side, you have guys who do this for a living who can run these things. And so they'll say, I'll set, over 3 months, I can force you to spend, over the next $200,000 in legal fees. I can just force you to, with discovery and with how this works, with litigation in China, Germany, and the US at the same time. I can flex in ways that will really make it painful if I'm playing in this patent space, and it, and I'll settle for you right now for 120,000. And they're like, but your patent is invalid. Like, this is a shakeout, a shakedown. All right. So and you do this a few times, and all of a sudden everyone comes around and says, well, we got to pay them. And so now there's a whole market and a company called Rational Patent Exchange, I used to work there, that acts on behalf of all of big tech largely to clear patent risk from entities who are really good at enforcing, because you do it at lower costs. But no matter what, all you're ever doing in this space is actually settling for avoided litigation costs, but it's still to the tune of 6 figures. And nothing about any of this has to do with the merits of an invention or whether you're actually infringing a patent. And in that vein as well, I'm going to probably talk, this has been coming up a lot in Discord threads and in this DeSci boom. And so I probably will want to talk about this a couple times, and don't mean to belabor it too much. But what I've seen in what I've done over the past 15 years in this space, and I've probably, just on account of where I sat in the market for 5 years at RPX, and I worked in an insurance arm as claims just settling patent troll litigation. So I've probably seen as many patent troll litigations and been involved as many settlements as everyone else out there on the planet, save 10 other people at RPX who are still there. And that. So you get a certain insight into how this works, and it's a huge shift from how I came to understand the market from before I went into RPX. When I was a patent litigator, when I was doing this stuff, I understood it differently. Then I came and saw this other business side, and now I understand that the IP market is fundamentally about IP risk management, not about IP monetization and enforcement of bespoke inventions. And when an economy scales, it's the network effects of risk management that are actually what the economy should shape around. And indeed, when the risk management market in the patent space scaled, which is done over the past 15 years, it has become the most stable, most resilient, and most profitable part of the IP market, really. Patent trolls are hitting, volatile. It's much more. You want a network resilient IP protocol that benefits and leverages network effects through risk management and risk pooling and collective action in order to build something that can, I think, fundamentally kind of improve the whole system we're all working on now. So anyways, didn't mean to derail that too much, but wanted to highlight.
No, it's not really derailing at all. And that is a nice encapsulation too of just going back to when we first had our first podcast, or I guess recording together with Rick Doblin, because that was really what drew us together, was thinking about how we could have these sort of risk management tools within the psychedelic ecosystem. You suggested it can be both, and a lot of times people think about patent trolls as being something that the Googles and the deep-pocketed companies have to worry about, but it is also really I think you mentioned like the mom and pop shops for little things. I mean, there's been state legislation passed because it's been so bad in some places. I think Washington and Oregon both passed legislation to prevent certain types of patent trolling.
30 plus states now have anti-patent troll letter.
Yeah, wow. Okay, so I mean, because you mentioned like Wi-Fi routers, but it is things as simple as that. I mean, I think there was a very large troll campaign for like streaming music that went after restaurants and cafes, coffee shops that were just streaming music, and it does cost hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to challenge a patent, but it might cost $20,000 or $50,000 even to get a patent attorney at a firm on retainer. So some of these coffee shops, somebody would just send them a letter and say, give us $10,000. And you're like, well, $10,000, that's, it's a huge portion of, well, give us $2,000. I mean, it would really just be shakedowns, and you could send them to hundreds of coffee shops, and many of them would pay you, and that was the business model. I mean, and so in the psychedelic space, nothing like this has fully developed yet, or I think is even all that far along. I think the one example maybe I'd like to note, just because it's something I'm working on, and I think it maybe should get some more visibility, although I think it will perhaps at some point. I've talked a lot about a patent. It's an example of a bad patent. You talked about low quality patents, Chris. One example of a bad patent that I'd like to bring up a lot is a patent on DMT vapes, which was filed in 2019, and in 2017 and 2018, not only did people know about DMT vapes, but there were articles on DMT vapes in Vice magazine and Double Blind and other places that people could have access to, and DMT Nexus and other websites told people how to make them and use them. But the patent office and the patent examiner, they just look at filed patents, and they did a search in Chemical Abstracts Plus, basically just to see the abstracts of scientific literature in the chemistry space. Didn't find DMT vapes, and after 7 minutes of searching, granted a patent on it. This patent now, which is actually owned by a patent lawyer who was, I think, in mind going after people. Actually, I know he has it in mind because people have shared a pitch deck he has trying to raise money for a company to actually go after everybody making and selling DMT vapes. And people sometimes ask me, well, DMT vapes aren't legal. Like, why could somebody even get sued for making or selling DMT vapes? Well, for one thing, also, the patent covers like 5-MeO and 2CB and some other vapes too. But people are using them in the underground. Obviously, people are selling them in the black market, but people are even using them in their underground practices, like 5-MeO DMT vapes, for instance. There are a lot of communities who use low dose titration for like meditation protocols, and many of these people are, you wouldn't call them drug dealers. They're often teaching classes where the work they're doing is maybe facilitated by it, or they're doing therapy that's facilitated by it, or just doing guided sessions. But they are identifiable online, and if a person that owns a patent sues them, there's an extra incentive for them to settle because they don't want to be dragged into court. They don't want to have their financial records or what they're doing, which is in violation of federal law, brought into federal court because patents are filed in federal court. Even in states where maybe like next year or even this year in some states, there's like in Colorado, there's some less or reduction in the kind of criminal penalties for things, but federally they're certainly all still illegal. So these people have an extra motivation to settle. So in an instance like that, of course, if they were all individually sued, it'd be hard for them to come together and fight the patent, try to invalidate the patent. So what we've done is are trying to like raise money philanthropically to have funding and bring people together in advance to like together join the patent, because in the aggregate, even if the settlements are $2,000 or $5,000, if those people all pitch it in now or some proportion of it now, not quite like a risk management scheme as one would be fully fledged, but similarly, it's kind of collective action to take care of something where people are better off by networking and thinking together how to do something than they would be if they were separate.
Yeah, and that's exactly. I mean, I think these are exact use cases that our bio DAOs, I think, will adopt, or I hope, or it's certainly the right vehicle. I agree, and while we've talked about just how strong that stick is of enforcing the patent, the other side of the response then is oftentimes like, right, this is why I hate the whole system, and just put it all in the public domain, and this the idea of what has been open source culture, but to unpack that some more, what's happening, I mean, even with open source culture, they're occupying their IP right. It's that you don't make open source software by not creating an open source license, and an open source license is predicated upon the exclusivity that the copyright actually creates in order to make the terms of the open source license enforceable, right? So otherwise, because when there is no IP, then it doesn't matter anyways. Everything's totally free. But what happens, right? What happens if we all just went open source and we're just giving all our ideas out into open science? Well, we don't start in a level playing field. So we start already in a system where big tech, big pharma, whatever it may be, can do, even if we had patents, they do what's called efficient infringement, which means just mow through these small guys' patents, and who cares? Force them to enforce on us And then let's see, are they gonna do really shake down, Apple and wonder maybe Apple will say, yeah, this patent I'll make an example of, you sit in this spot where all of a sudden they're not in a good spot, and it is what kind of rears back this need of needing patents. But let's even talk more broadly, so again, we go back to the open source side, which is really also the whole point. The people who adopt it is that they love it because they're encoding their ethics, which is encoding an anger and a frustration around this nonsense kind of automatic exclusivity policy that copyright, all of this stuff that happened, which is all right. But what's happened to date too, they just kind of stopped, so they didn't add any other conditions. So you say, now it comes up all the time, and these debates are much more salient now than, or they've come salient again after they were really salient in the 80s and 90s. Should we make peace licenses? Should we say, my AI can't be used to kill people, or, something like this? Open source stuff right now, you contribute to an open source library. There's nothing that would prevent someone from taking your creation and using it in one of their own to kill you. It's there. That whole piece is just missing in a way that if you analyze it back to real property, which is how IP is sort of analogized to in the legal system, it would be absurd. It would be absurd, but we don't have to get into that too much. But what it offers is to say, well, hey everyone, get power where you can. If you're getting slammed in the world today by some form of power, here's a space where you can claim some. And it doesn't mean you have to wield it like the people who you disagree with, just like anything else in the world. You get your own tool, and patents are tools. And Graham and I think that's probably how we started one of these articles we published in Max or something, but patents are tools, and it's how we use them. And they're even more, people say that about guns and stuff too, right? And patents are very different as well, even at that level. They're truly tools that can be very constructive. Fundamentally life affirming. And I do abolitionist work in this space with IP, and I'm very interested in how to really get behind making IP all of a sudden an asset that's much more about exchanging common care for one another, and kind of getting into something that just looks more life affirming more generally. And with that can include things like in DeSci. What do we really also our use cases that often come up? Someone's going to patent insulin and jack up the prices 1,000% in some new way, or whatever, and all of us think, well, DeSci will solve that problem. Well, we actually can just very quickly, rather than have it be an imaginary, solve that problem if everyone who owned those patents would just say, I'm going to add an ethical encumbrance to my patent that says no one can ever practice this if they charge 1,000% over, just enter some economic formula of a normal market price. And they will lose their license. All of a sudden they have a patent infringement problem, which the stick comes out if they break your ethical term. And that's what I think is really cool, and that's what we're trying to play with. And that's why we're also saying to the cannabis conference, don't throw it away. If you go that direction, you're just giving it back to Monsanto and to Philip Morris, because they're going to take it, and they can also figure out how to get little patent. Graham might disagree, and I'll respect him to maybe not even ask because of where his practice is versus mine, but I think anyone can, if you're willing to pay enough money, you can get a claim granted on anything. It just might be super narrow. And similarly, too, if you're willing to pay enough money, patent litigators like me, who are often invalidating patents, will say, oh, if you boil the ocean long enough, you'll find something to invalidate a patent. Just because, again, I don't think knowledge necessarily works, as a phenomena, consciousness maybe, with these little lightning bolts in this garage, without anything else going on in the world around me, that maybe these zeitgeist things kind of prove against these mythologies that underlie our system as well. And so in that vein, I think it is important that we reimagine what we're building, and there's no better. We're forced to reimagine IP, reconceptualize it in our brains when we interact with these new tokens and user interfaces that we have. And so what better time than for us to just take a breath and also think about rebuilding our whole IP culture so that it's just healthier for us all. It's just more life affirming. Anyway, so I'll pause there, but I get excited.
Speaking of taking a breath, but yeah, I'm sometimes comforted by the fact that we know at the end of the day you can always get a patent claim granted on something because the client never has to go home empty-handed. But yeah, I mean how narrow it is. Sometimes is the thing that makes it important or not. But we always also know that it's a bit of a roll of the dice with examiners. And examiners, so this DMT patent, for instance, was notorious for being one of the easiest examiners in his art unit. The way examiners are organized into technology centers and art units, and they examine things of the same sort of subject matter. All the statistics are available, and examiners, you can see over the years what their allowance rate has been, and they tend to actually polarize a little bit into some examiners that are much tougher and some examiners that are very easy, and people have many different theories about it. Examiners also tend to get much easier as they get more senior, so this particular examiner for the DMT vape patent was very senior. I think he'd been there several decades, which means he sort of knows how to play the game. He knows his role at the patent office is granting patents and making sure he can grant them swiftly. So, he's not really rewarded for spending more time to find more prior art or to invalidate patents. I mean, they see the patent applicants as sort of the clients of the patent office. The patent office makes their money by having more applicants file, and they see their role really as granting patents rather than keeping them from being granted. And yes, we did start our article. I know I couldn't remember the progress clause. Prayer or not, I forget my catechisms, but yeah, that actually was the Rick Doblin quote, which I think, in part used as a nod to the fact that was, to some degree, what brought us together, where he said psychedelics are tools, and they're not good or bad in and of themselves, but it's how you use them. And so he said the same thing is true about patents. And I do think that's one of the most important things to come back to. The sort of two ideas I like to remember, even myself, from having a conversation about patents, is the one I mentioned in the beginning, that patents are the creation of society, that what a patent is something for whatever we say as a society to come together to say, why do we have this patent? Wow, what are we trying to do with it? How do we make that serve our ends? And to think of it as a tool for achieving whatever those particular ends are.
I think this would be a really nice time to segue into our next topic, which is sort of the discussion of how IP trade obviously has an influence on how technological advancements progress. And one such example, which I think is a quite good example, and especially in the context of this being the Decentralized Science podcast, is the COVID vaccine, and how intellectual property was shaping how that vaccine got developed.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that's maybe a good example of both some of the negative ways that IP can influence, access to an invention. Maybe even a place before just quite getting to the COVID vaccine. I think there's also some historical background just on, I think in a similar vein with antibiotics too, I think, which is really interesting because Chris, you had mentioned, I think, insulin, which made me think, I think it's fairly well known, or people like to point out that the patent on insulin was sold for $1 because the inventor thought of insulin as being something sort of for the public good. And also when we think about just inventions in general and the sort of whether or not as a society we want to reward certain inventions or even call certain things inventions. So when we think of something like vaccines, we can try to think about whether it is something we want to reward a individual inventor, whether that inventor is a company or an individual with something like an exclusive right. So with antibiotics, for instance, the person who discovered penicillin, at that point, he didn't want to, and also it was sort of the understanding at the time that medical advances should be public goods and shouldn't be things that would be patented. And he thought it would be unethical to have something like a life-saving drug be unpatented. But because he didn't patent it, people in hindsight say it sort of languished because people didn't have the incentive to develop it. People weren't putting money into deciding whether or not there were ways to use it. It was very hard for people to make at any scale. However, it was, I think Andrew Fleming came up with it or Alexander Fleming, came up with it in like the 1920s. But like in World War II, it became very important to have penicillin because there was a lot of people getting wounds that would otherwise be infected. And at that point, the lack of having a patent became very important because now the US and the UK could set up whole systems for pharmaceutical companies to work together to develop ways of producing lots and lots of penicillin at scale. And the absence of having patents enabled this huge wartime push for the creation of all great amounts of penicillin, basically, which might have been very hard to do otherwise. So I guess I say that sort of in contradistinction to the COVID vaccine, because with the COVID vaccine, even though the U.S. funded much of the early research, some of the early patents on it, and some of the companies that had those patents on it stood in the way of the COVID vaccine being able to reach a great number of people because they were able to use those patent rights to prevent other companies from being able to access to technology to create more of it. And even when they were talking about sharing those patents, it wasn't just the patents themselves that stood in the way, but they also had all this other technology that they didn't want to transfer. So how would they make these mRNA vaccines? And they said, okay, we'll license you the patents for free. You can have the ability to use the patents. We won't tell you how to just generally make an mRNA vaccine. So this also sort of, I think, underscores one of the aspects about patents in general, which is if the point is disclosure, what has to be disclosed when you disclose what an invention is? To really be able to make and use an invention, what is the breadth of the disclosure that has to be included? So is it really the case that one is disclosed enough to make and use an invention? If anyone says, well, you can have a compulsory license to the invention, but because I'm not sharing this other information, this other know-how with you, then you can't actually make and use the invention. Is that in itself demonstrating that the patent actually wasn't teaching people how to make and use the thing that it gave exclusivity to? And so perhaps I've lost the thread of where I was going with that entirely, but I think, Chris, you know a lot about the sort of COVID, Open COVID pledge, and probably can chime in on some of that too.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think what happened in kind of connecting this to this evolution and open source culture as well, there's been increasing efforts over the past 20 years to do medicinal patent pools and try and figure out ways to make it cheaper for people to pursue, especially things for rare neglected diseases. Oftentimes problems that affect more people in the global south and global north and things like that. And it's kind of weird, right? I mean, no, actually, there's been success stories, but structurally, not, we don't see that things are just imminently going to be solved there with the plan. But what happened then is people said, all right, well, but let's keep trying. I mean, right, what else can we do? We need to figure out also where we're going wrong so we can improve it. And so Open COVID Pledge, what better time to say, maybe we can shift some IP culture here, because certainly doesn't seem like we need a patent to incentivize people to try and find a vaccine for COVID right now, right? I mean, everyone who had any chemistry skills in their brain, I think, was probably trying to think how in the world can we do this? And of course, it's cheaper in every single possible world of rational economics to have no patents get in the way when you have a global epidemic. You just want to manufacture, get out. I mean, it should just be, as far as any rational sense I can understand as an IP trade person, a completely generic, immediately sort of standardized market. But the question then, of course, is still what happens. So you create these efforts saying, you know what, obviously we don't have a system set up for a host of reasons that are involved, that are connected to lobbying and how the World Trade Organization has functioned and international trade more generally, that makes our compulsory license system one that just is not as what we need in many situations, and that's under the trade-related aspects of intellectual property, which is a part of the World Trade Organization that every member of the WTO has to agree to. And these are actually the rules that have become essentially the global backbone. Because so many members are in the WTO, they become a floor upon which nearly all countries have to standardize or at least harmonize their national IP laws, so there's compatibility. They can't go below certain floors. Well, so they put this call out saying, "Hey, everyone, let's share our IP," and social media jumped all over it. And of course, because for social media, who's also big, a lot of their devs, of course, I mean they've built their much of their private money off of open source software, with private layers on top, which is cool. I mean, that's what it's all for, of course. But they said, great, of course, we're used to this culture, and we know network effects. Let's give away our copyright and stuff to help to find who's sick, and this is super helpful stuff. But what happens after they're done with it? They still have our app, and we still, just switch this. It's just your typical great kind of good-looking ways to bring people onto a network in some kind of sales thing. Not to undermine the good intentions, but the economics are there. Who didn't join, right, is the more important question. And I don't think any. I might be, I'm certain that there wasn't more than like one pharma company who joined. None of the big ones, of course, because they don't know any better, right? This is also a thing where if you've just been in the market long enough and you have you're publicly traded and you have shareholders breathing down your neck and you got to do your quarterly thing, if all of a sudden you're going to say, I'm throwing out our whole patent model and I'm going to do something different, it's not going to work. And no one would want to do that unless they had to, even if it's the right thing, No, we're going to keep taking the 30-mile detour rather than just all of a sudden using the technology we have to dig a little tunnel and save ourselves a day, But that's kind of how it goes, I think. And so after this piece, got some stuff cool. This professor who was involved in developing it, named George Contreras, wrote this outstanding review of saying, let's make lemonade. Let's show where this worked and where it didn't. And he is this great law review article, and he walks through and outlines these principles of what happened and what hasn't, and why isn't this working, and what needs to happen for us to have a functional science commons where a community can co-develop IP for the public good and still have a rational business model going, and all of this. How do we do it? And it's exciting because if people look at this article, you'll see that it looks a lot of what it prescribes for what we need to do is exactly what I think the protocols that are being built in DeSci are designed to do. And this is largely around ensuring we have a means for dynamic governance and really alignment of economic incentives that just haven't been possible without crypto and these abilities to use tokenization for retroactive public good financing and all these different things we can play with now that all these brilliant people in the space are creating. But this fundamentally, where it hits these legacy efforts to common IP, to do these things that DeSci is doing now, what makes DeSci different? Well, actually, I mean, what we do is try and solve for the points of failure that happened with open COVID. But to further underscore the piece, we're still, Graham, correct me if I'm wrong, aren't we seeing aren't there 5 or 6 maybe open patent litigations right now involving COVID-related vaccines?
I believe so. One of the things about just even if the open COVID pledge would have worked, and even if there had been a pool, by the time they got it actually negotiated and set up and people bought in, most of the concern around COVID had already passed. So part of the maybe benefit of having the ability to do it in a much more frictionless way means it can be done when it's actually needed. I mean, part of the benefit of the fact that there were no patents on penicillin just meant the government could just jump in right away and say, okay, here's what we're doing. We don't have to negotiate these rights. We can just go straight ahead and do it. Another counterexample, it's one I know we use in our article, maybe you use it elsewhere, is with the Wright brothers, because they had patents on the airplane. Their patents on the airplane were really only enforceable in the United States. So in Europe, meanwhile in the US, the Wright brothers were suing everybody rather than advancing their own technology. When World War I came around, people in the US didn't really have very advanced plane technology because it was really just the Wright brothers and their desire to spend most of their money on lawsuits rather than like actual further research or figuring out how to advance their planes. And so the US had to actually like license technology from Europe to bring it in to be able to have plane technology for purposes of like building airplanes for World War I. And it's similar to like with the Open COVID pledge, even by the time they got around to negotiating this, sort of the time had passed. So it's really about figuring out how to have it structured so that the technology is available when it needs to be available, but perhaps with a middle way between having just the lack of patents like with penicillin and having with Open COVID. Another thing you mentioned is with, I think you said retroactive, like goods funding, or there's, when we think about patents, the reward is just the exclusivity. So the patent owner, if they get a patent, has the ability to set monopoly pricing, basically, or monopoly to the extent that there's, competing goods in the market, but they can, set the pricing because they have the exclusive right for whatever the invention covers. There's many other ways to provide rewards, and there's many other ways to structure what those rewards could look like. There's everything from the paying people to do research, so the government funding, say, research into COVID, or doing things like providing certain monetary rewards afterwards, or and so you obviously know much more about how crypto can do this than I do. But one of the things I think is exciting about it is when we kind of disassemble what a patent is and we try to kind of put it back together in a way that serves the actual policy interests we've decided we want. If we're creating it as a society, we can figure out how to take apart what that reward is and put it back together however we think is the best way. And with a patent, there's not a lot of sort of flexibility there. We've had different patent terms, like in Cerberus, it was 1 year exclusivity. In Venice, it was 10 years. Now it's 20 years from filing. For a while, it was 17 years from issuance. But there's not much flexibility just from the exclusive right itself. Certainly, we could make potentially some patents longer than others, and people have actually discussed that, especially in the pharmaceutical space. And actually, some countries historically, I think, have had different length patents. So patents on manufacturing a pharmaceutical maybe were longer, but the active compound maybe wasn't patentable at all, or was patentable for much shorter. Now, one of the big concerns in the pharmaceutical space is the evergreening. Somebody files the kind of key patent on the active compound, the thing that really was what took all the research and needed the incentive to get commercialized. And now they have the active compound on the market. Maybe it's a blockbuster drug. They want to see how they can extend the protection for that blockbuster drug as long as possible. So they'll file dozens or hundreds sometimes of follow-on patents covering it. And if they have some new formulation, or with an insulin pen, some new way that the insulin pen cap sits on the body of the insulin pen, should that give them another 20 years of exclusivity, or should that give them some shorter period? But even just thinking about years, that's not really that much to play with. Whereas if we're really creating a patent right kind of out of whole cloth, we can structure that reward however we want.
Yeah, the point about how this sits in. Wait, sorry, I totally lost my train of thought on where I was going to go with that. So we can move to
that's
that.
okay. I can think of something else to say. One other thing that I was going to say, one other thing that you reminded me about, Chris, was another sort of I don't know what the way of articulating what I'm saying is, but two sort of sides to a coin, or two aspects of looking at kind of a policy issue. similar, I guess, to COVID, or thinking about how patents work or don't work in a particular fashion, is with another kind of area of biotech, which is, I'll start by talking about what the positive one was. Like the very basic recombinant DNA technology was owned by scientists at the University of California, at UCSF with the UC Regents, and Stanford, these Cohn-Boyer patents. And because they were owned by Stanford and the UC system, the universities had a obligation to license that technology out in the public interest, in a way that would actually encourage its adoption by as many different companies as possible. And so these patents, which were really the foundational patents for all sort of gene cloning and all the sort of start of the biotech industry in the 80s, were licensed out to many hundreds of biotech companies, non-exclusively, so they could all practice it on relatively minimal royalties so that they could practice it in a commercially viable way, and so they could actually use it and experiment with it. And there were like dozens and dozens of, I think, maybe even thousands of products that ultimately came out of the license of these. And the universities, this was a huge boon to them. They ended up making hundreds of millions of dollars. It was actually a really good example of like how technology transfer from universities could be used to make a lot of money for the universities, and then led to a lot of other universities figuring out, well, what other technology do we have that we can do this with? But most people think, even though the universities made hundreds of millions of dollars, perhaps if it was one company that had it, they could have made billions of dollars and been like the monopoly single biotech company that had the rights to everything, or just slowed down in general, perhaps even for decades, for as long as the patents lasted, like the development of the technology in the biotech space. So part of the reason there was this huge flourishing in the 80s of biotech companies, many different biotech companies, lots of startups, still some large ones, but the way that they could like all grow from kind of an equal playing field was because this technology was licensed for the public good. But contrast that to other technologies which are held in just close hands. So like, for example, the patents that many people might know about on like the breast cancer genes actually just went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court invalidated the patents and basically set precedent that people couldn't patent just genes on their own, because one company, in owning the breast cancer genes, meant that not only could they control who was able to make the diagnostic tests for them, which was just them, so they were charging thousands of dollars for diagnostic tests, which meant that like many women couldn't even get tested for whether or not they had a higher likelihood of getting breast cancer because they couldn't afford these tests, but also meant just even companies that wanted to do research to develop therapeutics for breast cancer, because they might be using those breast cancer genes, could have been infringing. And so that, I think, is like an example of how like sometimes filing a patent on something and owning the rights to it means it really shuts off for a long period of time like further development of a technology, and really like kind of stifles the evolution of a particular technology until those patents can expire. And so like deciding who can own those foundational rights and who can use them, like that too can be something that can be baked into the, if we're setting up a different patent system. I mean, you talk about like ethical and kind of like the exclude the exclusion, like there's those sorts of rights that one can grant by having exclusive right itself, if we're thinking about the patent. But if we're broadening what we conceive of as even the patent itself, if we're, say now, not the U.S. Patent Office granting patents, but if we're a DAO or another, creating a new type of patent right, a new type of, whether we call it a patent right or call it something else, we can decide, well, if you're going to have this foundational technology that's really a research tool, that has to be diffused to these types of entities on these types of terms, and like the not just the patent length of the patent term, but and not just the reward, but even like the exclusivity itself is another aspect of the patent. If we take it apart, that we can decide how we want to, set that and how we want to use that to serve whatever ends we think are the right ones.
Yeah, it's interesting to think historically too, in this trade context where we sit today, It's been about a century or so since we've had a tariff war that looks like what's on the horizon globally. Tariff wars like that are always, I mean, they tend to come with wartime economies. But in the 20s, I mean, so like the International Trade Commission, which is the scariest court in the US to get sued, probably in the world, to get sued on patent infringement just because of the pace and the consequences, which is shutting down the flow of goods across the border. I mean, it's a longshoreman strike or something, right?
Mhm.
You're done in the water. It's an injunction, and that was really 1932 Tariff Act is when that came in, and it was an IP largely driven towards IP
So
suits.
I'm
But
going
what
to
happened?
interrupt.
Yeah.
What is tariff act?
Oh, yeah. So the 1932 Tariff Act in the United States, a tariff is, of course, the tax that you put on goods as they come in or out of a country.
Oh,
And typically, what's happened for the past 40 years, generally, of kind of like global general neoliberalism and this effort towards international trade and lowering tariffs is to say, we'll expand global trade networks, we'll make the flow of goods much cheaper. And all of that, the core of that, and this is really the core of the World Trade Organization, is centered on, I mentioned the TRIPS agreement, the trade related aspects of intellectual property, is one agreement in the WTO. There's two other agreements. And the main one, the really important one, is the general agreement on tariffs and trade. And then there's another one on general agreement on trade and services. But they're all important. But the GATT is the one that is the GATT, the tariffs and trade. And what it had always been globally as Europe's emerging from wartime. It's everyone's the nation state, this whatever experiment that's been so far is going to continue on. People start negotiating as countries. Well, what tax are you going to charge on my cotton coming in? And what tax am I going to charge on yours? And when you go protectionist, the tax falls on the consumer. Sorry to everyone who's been hearing something different. I guess they haven't taken just middle school economics or something. So the tariffs fall on the consumer, and so this also you get it right. So with IP, what happened is we got into this position where it was like decreasing tariff schedules, standardized patent length, like Graham was saying. And who set that term? Like, why 20 years? I mean, imagine if, so it's 2024. Oh, guys, finally, the software from like Windows 98 just came off patent. I can't wait I can finally get an advantage now that I can use. Software just moves like so much quicker. And that's why for them too, the patent system is beyond absurd. And if anything, you'd say, well, maybe give us a 1 year, I don't, something different from 20. Well, it was Big Pharma who had kind of cooked up the system that ended up becoming TRIPS and through very strategic plans over from the mid 70s onwards, built out a IP system that they managed to install, into a world trade organization, much, to the benefit of IP producing countries and their exports. But so where are we now? If we go back now, all of a sudden we're ripping back a century to these new trade dynamics. Well, why wouldn't we put on the table, like with a tariff schedule, where we're negotiating taxes on specific goods? I mean, these things are thousands of pages of specific goods down to, it's so tedious. We can do the same thing. We have these exact, tedious technical categorizations on the cover of every patent. What field is it in what? Those are so ripe to be negotiated, like tariffs, to change patent terms and invite in, just like Venice did. Invite people in to your DAO, to your jurisdiction, to your whatever, to your country, to your community, by figuring out what you want to attract in, maybe less protection, maybe more, you play the game. That I think is, maybe one of the big drivers. Maybe we'll even see that leads us to create these private networks as private IP networks with a bit more, have them be a bit more. We can experiment more and see what works. And I think it could happen around these, these types of dynamics.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm only saying this because I just thought of it now, so maybe there's not much to it. But one could, with a patent pledge, for instance, even pledge in advance, like if my technology is within this classification, then I pledge everything from year 8 onward to the public, or to from these years for this type of research, or I mean, there's ways, even if we don't yet have a system that we've completely created from scratch, we can use by cobbling together tools that we have elsewhere, like patent pledges. So one can pledge, for instance, if we had new technology that could be used with vaccines, we can pledge to those who are developing vaccines, even if we could be, say, using it for something else that we might want to have the profit from, but for vaccines, we would want to donate it or have it be used for free. We can pledge it or pledge it to just certain entities who might be using it in a certain way. But yeah, I mean, the pharmaceutical industry is very interested in, obviously, the length of patent term. I think the first case I worked on was actually litigating over 11 extra days of patent term for a blockbuster drug, and there were dozens of lawyers working on it, I think, for like over a year to determine whether or not this patent would expire 11 days earlier. Because, you know, if you're making, I think it was a little over 3.5 billion a year, 11 extra days are worth a lot more than just the lawyers. I think there was even a malpractice case where a patent firm filed a pharmaceutical patent the day early when there was like a holiday, and they should have filed it one day later after the holiday, because that extra day cost them, however much money at the end. But of course, I mean, all the patent applications that cover things like, the many thousands in an iPhone, I'm sure are by year 20 not really worth very much.
But also, I mean, just to help orient everyone listening to what's at stake, like, we're mentioning 3.8 billion in sales that you can get off of a patent in a year. Damages across, and that pharma, has long had, those are the heavy hitting ones. Big tech now as well. We've seen what is it? Is that a 10-figure damages over $1 billion on some tech patents that I think Carnegie Mellon had, and then they just reported, I just saw an email today, highest patent damages for 2024, and all of them are 9 figures, hundreds of millions. And so just that scale of what's at stake in the economy is completely unrivaled in what you really do in any other type of common litigation. And that's why, as well, patent litigation just has so little to do with the invention or the merits, and it has so much more to do. I mean, at the big law level, right? I mean, Graham, I don't know if you would agree, or of course, if our old clients here would agree, but if you think of the giant, Nokia, Apple, these guys, Samsung, in these giant fights, which all of us have, Graham and I both litigated in a lot of those spaces before, it does not feel like what they're really worried about is some key patent. What they did is took their library of a ton and said, find me the ones that read best on Android. And the Android people say, find me the ones that read best on Apple. And then you sue those, but you don't care. You're just looking to hurt. And so, and why 95% of them all settle, and they settle in cross-licensing deals every time if it's two operating companies. And so in this way as well, we're looking at market power, raw market power that people can then wield how they want. And also to these ends, I mean, just to underscore the IP ethics point in the trade context that Grandma mentioned of saying, well, in some instances, people have grabbed the patent and then they haven't done anything. They haven't told people that it's still okay to do non-commercial research or, whatever. And that is, you're occupying a space and you're not doing something with it. And I think it's important that we help build a culture where people realize that's not being neutral. That's threatening enforcement. If you don't tell people you're not going to, you hold the right to do it. You're not playing in the space in this way. That is what I think we're trying to suggest that people do, which is to say grab it, but it's more than grab it. It's grab it and like own it and integrate it into the world you're trying to build, because this is exactly the absurd point we're saying. We're saying there's a $72 trillion economy. All of us listening, all of us on this are IP producers in the economy, and it's how we get paid. Probably the majority of us do not want to see climate change happen the way that it's looked like it's going to happen. All of us are giving that we can also point out what parts of the supply chains do we need to change and what are the worst ones. Well, we're still all giving our IP to that. if we all would just stop and say, if everyone who didn't want a certain bad, you know, climate change thing to happen or something, if everyone got together and just say, well, our IP is not available for anyone commercializing under those practices. I mean, that can scale really quickly. And if you have some good IP in there, you only need one patent reset, to start wielding a bad stick. But there's power there, and that's what I think we want to tap into in DeSci. We want to create a framework so all this stuff just becomes easier, and we can get rid of all the nonsense, but just make it something that gets us back into what is really the community governance and the stuff we're trying to do in building this culture here to help it translate, and everything kind of that way. But so yeah, in those senses too, I do think it would be cool to see inside the DAOs if DAOs would take on this challenge if they could scale. Maybe we can try this with SciDAO, where people maybe take the Calyx patent pledge or something, but we invite real business in who are these public benefit corporations and say, get a patent and tell us, after 7 years, do the whole thing and see if we can't do it. Because at that point, we really are, if we do a better job in validating the quality of the IP, making sure we aren't issuing patents on DMT vapes. It's not hard when you know the non-patent literature as well, which is what the psychedelics lawyers know and the patent office doesn't, to do a better job. I mean, so what if we did that? And go ahead.
Yeah, and finding ways to use patents to really encourage continued research and development. Like one of the issues with, you mentioned like some of the smartphone patents, is once the monopoly was obtained, there was no interest in continued research. The interest was in keeping that monopoly power to be able to use it as market power. As soon as Apple sued Android, I think there's some writing about how the more the money they spent during all the years of those smartphone litigations was on lawyers and litigation, and very little of it was spent on R&D. And arguably, the iPhone hasn't really changed all that much from once it got like a dominant position. They've been more focused on maintaining that dominant position rather than continued research. And that's similar to like with the Wright brothers, they didn't develop their plane technology. They wanted to just keep infringers off and keep the prices of their planes as high as possible. I think, one of the things we talked about in our article too was like the early patents. We went through a number of ways that once patents were obtained, those patents were used until they expired to just preserve the monopoly rather than to continue developing further technology within that area. So like, I think the steam engine was a great one because the steam engine is often used as an example of technology that was patented and was successful. But during the time that the patent was active, the only thing it was really used for was pumping water out of mines. And then once the patent expired, which meant now James Watt and the others who was that had sort of the very narrow band of early patents, once those expired, then it became used for everything else, for boats and for the road locomotive, the first car, and for many other things. When people could now start putting it and experimenting with it and doing other things with it, and so there's a way I think too in designing how the patent incentive is structured and how the patent exclusivity is structured to ensure that it's not just obtaining a monopoly that then sits and just really is a means of extracting the continued sort of reward of having gotten it as just sort of a tax on everybody using it, but actually a means of encouraging further innovation even in that space, but at least not shutting down innovation.
I would be really curious to know. So I think, we've been chatting now for an hour and a bit, and what is, obviously very clear is that intellectual property is a huge sort of economic engine that, is really making the world go round to a certain extent. And I read an article a while back that was basically discussing how companies' asset strategies were more and more shifting to become IP asset strategies rather than sort of having real world assets. Like that was how they were wanting to build and grow their sort of potential. Would you think that it's fair to say that sort of the IP industry is really continuing to grow and occupy more space in global trade?
Yeah, well, it certainly is. I think Chris pointed out that statistic about $70 trillion is based on IP or based on intangible assets. And certainly many companies are finding ways to obtain IP and then use the IP to create royalties, to create ways of monetizing the IP itself, rather than and let others do the hard work of the manufacturing or the actual practicing, and just use the IP as a tool for being able to just generate wealth from the idea itself, rather than from whatever the practice of it would be. So I'm not sure that's answering exactly the question, but
Chris, do you want to go? Do you want to go? Yeah.
you had something to say, Chris?
No. Yeah,
Okay.
I was thinking.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, to kind of lead into our last topic for the evening, or your day actually, but the start of your day.
Start of my day.
Is sort of, I think, like looking at the IP industry now today, what would you say are the sort of active pressures at the moment that are shaping how IP is developing?
Well, that's a big question. I think some of the active pressures are the controversies around how IP is used, and some of the drawbacks of strong IP in particular. So we've talked about many of these today, or suggested many of them. For instance, with the COVID vaccine, with pharmaceuticals, the high cost of any drugs, the inability for some people to obtain drugs. We've talked, I think, a little bit about like the impact that the harmonization of IP laws around the world has had, especially because of the way it can divide countries into those who own all the IP and those that sort of pay the kind of tax on the IP and maybe don't get the benefits of having their own R&D rewarded, or even building R&D or industry that can support R&D themselves. I think and you mentioned like tariffs, Chris, just in general, the like global trade implications of IP. So I think in the next few years, we'll probably see some controversies. Hopefully they don't go beyond the ones we just talk about politically into anything else, but around like semiconductors, and we've already sort of seen it with 5G, with like AI, and it's sort of like a competition between like China and the U.S. or the U.S. and other countries heats up. The way that IP is used, I think, will perhaps demand us to look differently about how we are, like, as the U.S. as a society setting the sort of policies around IP. But I think one of the aspects, and Chris, you really inspired me to think about this a lot, is just the fact that you don't just have to go to the USPTO and knock on their doors and tell them, here's how we want the patent system to look, or, call our congressman and say they should go, knock on the door of the USPTO to say this is how our patent system to look. Like, if we really think about making the patent right the creation of society, if we think of ourselves as not just being in the U.S. as our society, but there are other societies we can participate in, like SciDAO, for instance, you mentioned, or, other DAOs, we can think of ways that we can design, whether we call them a letter patent, whether it's a public proclamation, a royal proclamation, or whatever it is, this
knowledge bomb.
open proclamation to the world. How we create these incentive structures, or reward structures, and what we do with them. Like, one of the things I didn't mention in answer to one of your earlier questions, but I was thinking about it again last night because I was thinking about different ways of monetizing IP, and one thing that's probably taught in a lot of law school classes, or people learn about when they learn about the monetization of IP, is David Bowie, actually. And I don't know if you know about these Bowie bonds, Chris. Like, he was one of the first people that sort of got notoriety. He wasn't the first to, like, kind of, I was securitize is sometimes a dirty word in the crypto space, but to securitize his IP royalties. So he actually was not the owner of his whole catalog, but he wanted to buy his catalog. So what he did was he monetized the future royalties, 10 years of future royalties from his songs, and sold them as bonds. They call them the Bowie bonds. And And so I think he sold them for like 50 something million dollars, Bowie bonds. They paid 8%, which was better than the treasury were paying. And even though it was, I think in like the end of the 90s, just before like Napster and, just before the real kind of like loss of the ability to make money from music, still was able to, pay the bondholders. And ultimately he got his whole catalog back. And there's lots of ways of doing that. I mean, in the biotech and pharma space, there's a whole industry set up to like pay for future royalty streams in advance so that research can happen to create those future royalty streams. So thinking of ways to incentivize research and innovation. I mean, at the end of the day, the point of the patent system, just like it was in ancient Sybaris, is to come up with, maybe they're not refinements in luxury or opulent seafood dishes, but whatever the innovations or inventions or new things we want. What is a novelty? What is what we want to have more of that we don't have now, basically? How do we create more of whatever it is we don't have now? What is the system to do that? Patents is, and why I was glad you started with history. Historically, this is just the way we've come up with some means to create new things, basically. So now we have this whole flexibility of like this whole new world that I'm like glad to be able to claim a little bit of, and I'm glad Chris has brought me into it a little bit, and I'm glad to participate as much as I can. But this whole new kind of world, this new landscape where we can create this entire new, and I sometimes steal your word, but reimagine this whole new, which is, Chris's sort of conception of IP, reimagine this whole new incentive or reward for coming up with new things, basically, for whether we call it an invention. It's really just something we haven't seen before, this novel thing. How do we have more of that? And that, to me, is personally what I love so much about working in patents, is because it brings me into connection with new things. I get to learn about new things from my clients who come to me and with their excitement saying, here's this thing I created, how do we protect this? But I think all of us, even if we're not patent lawyers, we're excited by novelty, we're excited by experiencing new things. Maybe if we're in Web3, we're here because this is kind of a new frontier and we're excited about the newness, but we can use what we have in Web3, and we can use what we have to encourage more newness, reward more newness, and think of new ways of doing that, and think of new ways of doing that that are better than the ways we have now, with all the flaws of the the U.S. patent system or the global patent system in these new societies. By having created these new societies, now in these new societies we can have the creation of these societies be this new patent right, this new proclamation that can encourage things that we just want more of that we don't have enough of now.
Yeah, and one perspective I want to add, I think on the the potential volatility or tension that I think is, well, hopefully imminent in the best of ways around IP and its value in the economy and what the pressure is on how to develop it. And it goes back, Ella, to your point about, there's been this, I think of it as IPification of the global economy. And the thing that always comes to my mind, that sticks with my mind, is that in the early 1980s, if you look at the balance sheets of the Fortune 500 companies, 80% was in real assets, brick and mortar, product, and cash in this instance even counts as real assets, and only 20% were in intangibles, and that really meant IP and know-how. It's fully inverted today. So now, if you look at the balance sheet of the largest tech companies out there, it's more or less 80% is in all intangibles, and only 20% is down to brick and mortar. And I mean, when you think about that for Apple, and I forget what their exact breakdown is, but we're in the right range. But think of how many brick and mortar Apple stores. Think of all the Apple product, and then think like, wait a minute, that's the tip of the iceberg to the value, the market value, the market recognized value of the company, because 80% is in IP. Now what happened, right? What is IP again? And we can talk about all these different esoteric things from a materialist perspective. Blah, blah, blah. I mean, at the end of the day, it is culture, and it's there because we believe it and uphold it and think it should. It's impossible to enforce IP en masse. I mean, the state doesn't enforce IP either, right? It's only the individuals who can enforce against each other. And if no one believes in it, then it goes to zero. In the same way that a patent goes to zero when it's deemed invalid. That patent the day before, everyone believed in it as being valid and enforceable. Ruling came out the next day, it's just done, right? Well, what happens if we start to really play with new culture and 80% of it is sitting on the balance sheet? And you start to, is this going to get volatile in terms of how we're reframing even how these assets start to participate in the market and stuff like that? And that, I mean, that's some big, that's interesting stuff. That's fireworks in the market historically when you see those types of dynamics start to unlock with just wild, oftentimes, opportunity for innovation. Cambrian explosion of a whole new, you won't want to call it finance, but it is much. We had the financialization of the global economy. We have the IPification. And so this IPification, rather than, we can see all this innovation. And I also just want to add, I don't think the irony is lost probably on all of us as we note that the IP system, the thing that is supposed to incentivize creativity and innovation, is a 17th century, cart with square wheels. Like, this thing is so old and we hadn't innovated with it. What happened? It didn't seem like it was properly incentivizing its own upgrades. But yeah, so just wanted to mention that 80-20 flip as well, because this is serious. And I actually think as well, it's incumbent upon, we start playing around with big power, you got to handle it responsibly. And we know our clients, our DeSci, are real people who want to take this seriously. And so I think in that vein as well, understanding that the networks we're building to support this and to make this better for everyone can still be safe, and don't make people freak out about participating. And in fact, because it's DAO, again, we're in DAOs, we're in Web3, we're in like collective ownership. We're not talking about risks of centralization that then people getting rugged and stuff. We're talking about being able to build new networks that handle the stuff we need and allow things to move, I think, safely and intelligently, but also with the potential of like transforming that part of the balance sheet.
Thank you so much, Chris. Yeah, this has been such a fascinating conversation. I think, understanding IP always feels a bit shadowy, and one of these sort of like forces that I think obviously drives the world so much, but one that I think people are not very, it could feel a bit murky at points for people coming in. I think at some point in this podcast, Chris, you literally said, like, I don't blame anyone for the fact that they have no clue how IP works. And so this conversation, I think, has been so helpful in kind of elucidating some of the more important points. And I'm sure everyone who's listening to this is going to feel way more educated. And I think the education empowers people, and that's the most important thing, is for people to be feeling empowered in their knowledge. So yes, a really big thank you to both of you for joining the podcast today.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm glad to get to talk some more about patents with you, Chris, and I'm sure we'll continue, but it's glad to have this opportunity, this venue here. So yeah, I love the DeSci podcast, so it feels a privilege to be a part of it. So.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you both. Yeah, thank you so much, Ella and Graham. Yeah, it's always I always have so much fun with both of you actually getting to talk. So thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, and you've been a great, even a moderator at times, but great question, Ella, too. I know sometimes when Chris and I get together, we probably just want to talk to each other. So it's apologize for
it's been an honor
role,
to witness the bromance. Cool. Okay. Thank you so much, guys. Have a beautiful day.